Up this week. It has been an absolute manic week. All the teams that I've caught up with next DC, just to name a few, quite a few networking events, and not just that, but taking the time to catch up on a one-to-one personal level has been really, really engaging, and I've really enjoyed it. I will post some more photos up so that we can all share together and educate ourselves as well as others. Now, very, very important week. We've had a lot around password security, password hygiene in the last few weeks, and it's been a great way to educate ourselves. But one of the key questions that keep coming up, and that has been the last few weeks, is around a digital presence. Now, when we talk about digital presence, there's quite a bit to talk about in regards to that. But when we're talking about that today, we're talking from a business or an organizational perspective. And because of that, I have a very special guest joining me today in Ben Barin. And Ben, welcome. Thank you very much for joining me, my friend.
Well, I've always wanted to say this, but thanks for having me, Kristof.
Mate, you're on, you're live, you're active. Now, between the two of us, we've had a number of conversations, and we talked about this recently because a number of questions have come my way. And look, websites and the digital presence are not something that I generally work very closely with, and that's your skills and forte. But the one that we've had a lot around is, so we've talked around digital presence, and we're not talking about a social media presence. We're talking about a business's digital presence.
Yeah.
Talk to me about what does that look like and why is that important?
Okay, I think a good place to start when it comes to talking about your digital presence is defining it as your online footprint, because as you mentioned before, it's not just your social media presence; it's also your website. It can also be your email campaigns that are going out there, or any sort of advertising, even maybe your staff or members of your team's profile as it sits out there on social media. So don't forget that it all connects up, if it's done correctly, of course, but it all connects up and sort of feeds this idea that you have this digital footprint. And for me, my principal belief is that that is a valuable asset for your organization. And as such, it's important to treat it as an asset, one that has investment and a return. And I think that's why it's bears worth talking about in detail.
Right. And then one of the things we've talked about, a digital presence can be like a billboard in the Sahara Desert, right? From that perspective, there is no point in putting it up there unless you're driving traffic to it. Is that a fair point?
Absolutely. I mean, in even websites can be more expensive than billboards. And if you put all that time and money into it and you don't get traffic to it, well, you're just looking at a sunk cost.
Yeah, look, so there's been a lot of, let's call it, media around digital presences lately, right? And we've talked about the concept of what happens in one, you've got to build it and you've got to keep it up to date.
Yes.
So I'll get you to talk a bit about that, but also too, how do you make sure that you're keeping up to speed with what's on there and how you're locking that down and securing it?
I think that's actually a really good question for businesses of all sizes. I actually talk about this a lot. And I think probably the starting point is that you need to know, or at least have someone in your organization that you trust that knows about the information that's on your website or the content that might potentially be subject to security requirements. I often imagine that as an IT professional, many people don't know about their domain name or where it's hosted or who has control. And it can be the keys to the kingdom. The reason I suggest that is because the number of times I've been handed control of the domain name sort of speaks to me as the people's general understanding of the value that sort of information is. So first things first, know what you've got. If you're collecting information, know where it's being stored, and probably to that end, know who's in control of that. I think that's something that people overlook.
Yeah, look, you made a really strong point there, right? If we're talking about not just a digital presence, we're talking about a business's digital name, right? And that's when we start talking about specifically, it's just that whole concept. You rattled my mind. I didn't even think about that. The domain names, right? And the keys to your kingdom, literally, to the point where those can be pilfered and therefore you can have your whole domain stolen. So talk to me about some hygiene around securing that and what are the best steps behind that?
Well, so for me, one of the first things that I do when I engage with a client is I make sure that they know where the domain name is. And usually best practice is that it should be sitting with their IT provider or their IT professional. And that's because the IT professional knows what you're doing, but two, you obviously have a relationship with them. You're trusting them with the infrastructure of your business. So I think it's important as a web developer who is effectively encroaching on that domain to make sure that we have a good relationship with the IT provider or the IT specialist within the business, because things can get lost between the cracks. Just as importantly, I think that should also extend to the hosting provider. If the hosting provider is either the IT company or the web company or a third-party business, it's hyper important that all three organizations are at least aware of each other and that they're letting each other know about what's going on when things are happening, or if any changes are being made, because we are playing in the same sandpit, more or less.
Yeah, you make a really valid point, and the concept around that, I guess, extends to sharing, right? And one of the top tips from this session is when you're sharing, please do not ever send passwords via email. There is just no need or no means for you to share a password via email. I think you and I have discussed this where we've seen certain
Yeah.
things. Always find an alternative medium to share username and passwords. We have so many mediums to do that across, including platforms like 2FA, platforms like SMS,
Yes.
key lockers, key guards, etc. And so, yes, there's a ton of ways to share that information rather than emailing it. When we're talking about hygiene and personal security, that is so critical.
Oh,
Now,
absolutely. Oh, sorry.
no, go. One of the questions that we had, right, is so I've seen a lot of websites breached, right, and we've seen a ton of this happening.
Yep.
And it's not hard to see because generally speaking, when we've seen engagements on, say, a simple website platform that's been built, okay, and it generically can be built on something like WordPress because it is a very common platform, right? Top tips. Tell me, what should people be considering? Because obviously there are a ton of legacy platforms out there that live on, let's call it easy-based WordPress.
Yes. Look, I think probably there's sort of three things that I generally like to set up when I engage or when we're handling a website. I think the first thing is making sure, as to this previous point, that we have a very good, strong relationship with the hosting company, because security happens on several layers of the application. And one of them, the base one, is often the hosting environment. For us, I like to tell clients it's good to have one throat to choke. We like to host and manage and build the website, because there's no excuses then about whose problem is what and what happens is. And you need to coordinate with those providers when you do have a breach, or if you have a breach and you need to solve that problem. I think secondarily, governance. It's everything. All platforms are subject to some sort of vulnerability or weakness. I mean, WordPress is free, Drupal is free, Joomla is free. There's a lot of free things out there. And one of I think the easiest way to just stay good is to have good governance. And by that, I mean daily backups, good password security, making sure that you're applying the security patches to your website, making sure that who's got access to what. Have you ever logged into the back end of a website and you're like, who's that guy? Who's that person? Who's that person? These people just have random access to your site, and they can do password forgot processes to get access. I think the third thing, which is very important, and again, something that we like to work closely with, we encourage all of our customers to have, is to make sure you have a good disaster recovery process. Especially with WordPress, one of the things you can do is if you get hacked, you can either pay us a lot of money to resolve that hack, or you can blow that website away and just restore from a backup that morning. So I think it's important. I mean, that's if you don't have continuously updating things, in which case you might need a more sophisticated backup system. But that is a huge amount of risk for your organization. If you're investing time and money into developing content, gosh, forbid, selling products, generating inquiries, and all of a sudden you have a compromised website that you have to either delete, or you're facing a large expense in fixing the compromise, then a good disaster recovery plan will go a very long way.
Yeah, look, let's take that one step further as a top tip. Never keep the standard administrative account active. When you start a WordPress, Drupal, etc. site, there's always the standard administrative password, administrative account. Create an alternative one and disable the standard admin. By default, please, everybody, if you ever have that issue, make sure that's the first thing you check when you're looking at your website. So now we've talked about security, we've talked about governance, we've talked about that. Why is a digital presence so important for an organization today? And what is it that you think will make let's call it a digital presence stand out?
This is my favorite type of topic, actually. But so cut me off if I keep rambling. But my fundamental belief is that a website is an asset. It's one that should be invested in and can return huge amounts to the business or organization that owns it. In some cases, it can even contribute significantly to the valuation of a business. And the reason for that is, one, I believe that a website and its associated properties, so your digital footprint, if you like, has an inherent value just in the time and the money that you invest in it to get it up. You've paid a designer, you've invested time and money in a copywriter, you've got the developer infrastructure, you've got this hosting cost that you've been paying for a long time. That is an asset. Otherwise, it's just a money pit for you. And why are we bothering with that? I think most businesses recognize that a website helps the lead generation or the sales process of it, but it can also be so much more. And I like to talk to companies and organizations about how they can extract or how they can realize that value over a period of time, because it is a complicated space. There's a lot to think about, from Google Analytics, AdWords, conversion rate optimization, SEO, Elon Musk, I don't know, like there's so much stuff going on there. How does Instagram relate to your blog article? How does that then turn into an EDM? What is remarketing and how does that leverage that customer journey? These are big, complex questions. And they're either going to suck time away from you because they need to be answered, or you can take that time and invest it to make sure that that activity returns a result that's valuable for the organization.
Yeah.
So
No,
I
really
think
agree
don't
on that.
underestimate it.
Yeah, and it's an interesting concept, because when we talk about this, we talk about digital assets, and then we talk about data as the criticality of a business, right? It's a common misconception marketing use that data is the new oil. No, data has been the oil for the last 5 years.
Probably longer.
Yeah, at least. And we saw that change when we saw infrastructure running the world, and then apps started to run the world in
Yeah.
the early 2000s. We're now talking now that the data is everything before and above the application. So from that perspective, when we're talking about that perspective of digital presence and data, the sharing of data across platforms can also become really critical. Are there any key points that we as, people need to be mindful of, and how do we then address those?
So you're talking about the movement of data from one area to another?
Well, using that digital web presence, and how do we use that data to then enrich, let's say, the rest of the sales cycle?
Oh, great. I mean, I think that's because data can mean so many things. It doesn't necessarily mean the names and email addresses of the people that you're talking about. It can sometimes mean the frequency that someone engages with a piece of information, or it can also mean, the time of day that someone visits your website. So I think it's really good to understand the different types of data that your business is exposing itself to, either collecting or providing to other people, and looking for ways to exploit that information. Like, a good example that isn't just name and email address is time of day. You want to ramp up your activity there. If you're in AdWords, which the data is what ad is generating the best results so that you invest in it. In SEO, the data is what is the keyword that gets searched a lot for, but other competitors don't show up for. That becomes an opportunity. And, the bottom line is this: all of the data that you collect, there's communication potential with your customers. I mean, I know as a businessman, I spend so much energy just trying to get communication numbers, emails, details, and connections with people. It kind of just, for a long time, it just goes into my email library, as my email history. And
Gets lost.
where does it go? And there are
That's
so
it.
many tools out there. And again, coming back to the footprint, that's your CRM, and that's your potentially your ERP even. So I think it's important to have that picture in mind, and maybe even develop a strategy on how to manage and where to store that, how to protect it.
Yeah, look, and that's a pretty vital conversation piece, and that's something we certainly will talk more about in future episodes, because data is critical, but you also need to enrich it across. So there's been a lot of questions about how we do that. Now, we're going to wrap this up. Unfortunately, we're sort of getting to that end of the conversation. I know we both could talk about this forever, and we really do enjoy that concept of how do you get that digital asset to work for you in both data as well as recurring ROI, as we've spoken about. What is your golden tip for people out there when they're thinking about this digital part of their organization?
Oh, the one thing that I recommend everyone do, that I see organizations big and small miss out on, is create a plan for growth. And don't just pay the money and expect a result the next month. And then when you don't get a result, just cross your fingers and hope it turns around the month after. I think connecting it to data will allow you to make better decisions. There's that old adage, if you measure it, it will grow. I think that's important. Having a baseline of understanding and finding a clear role for the people that contribute to your online presence. But yes, number one thing, have an objective, break it down into milestones, and make sure you're meeting and looking at the data and your performance and your ROI at those milestones, so that you can make a better decision to either avoid missing your next milestone, or if you're overshooting, happy days, realign your goals so that they're more appropriate for the organization.
Brilliant, brilliant words, Ben. I really appreciate your insights on this. Thank you so much. I know I had a ton of questions around this, so it's
Thanks,
great to
Kristof.
finally get you on the session with me and answer some of these questions. So, as always, I have tagged Ben. He is available on LinkedIn. If you have any further questions, comment below. We will both get to them within an hour or so, because once it becomes live, we can respond. Any questions, reach out to either of us on direct message. As I like to say, think before you click. Definitely at the moment, there is a lot more scams happening. We're seeing it. I know Ben and you and I have both seen that on our text messages. And please be mindful, especially at the moment, there is a ton of text messages coming through saying, Mum or Dad, I need money. I'm your daughter or your son. Contact me on this number. Please do not respond to that. That is false scamming happening at its best. Now, be safe, be well, everyone. As always, any questions, please send them through. I look forward to connecting with you all next week. And as I like to say, please be mindful when you're online. Thanks again for joining me, Ben.
Thanks, Kristof. It's awesome. Thanks
Talk
for
to you all
having me. It was great
soon.
to